I'm Margaret Weller, 68 years old, and last Thursday I sat at my son's dinner table while my granddaughter whispered, "Shut up, widow," and no one said a word. My hands were folded in my lap, a cloth napkin bunched beneath them, and for a second I thought I might stand up and scream. Instead, I passed the salt and watched cranberry sauce slide down a porcelain plate like blood at the edge of a wound. I had baked the ham, stirred the potatoes, folded the napkins like I always did. But that night, I knew something had changed. They didn't see me anymore. Not really. Not as their mother. Not as their grandmother. Just something left over from someone else's past. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever sat through a dinner where you felt like a ghost at your own table. I was born in a small town outside Richmond, Virginia, raised in a house where you took your shoes off at the door and said thank you for every meal. Even if it was just biscuits and beans, my parents worked hard and taught us to do the same. They believed in saving what you could and giving what you had without expecting anything in return. I carried those lessons into adulthood. Worked nearly 4 decades as a school librarian, married a man named Henry who wore suspenders and whistled while he worked, and we built a quiet life together, just the two of us, and later, our 2 children. Our son Mark always had a quick mind and a sharper tongue. He married young to a woman named Rachel, who rarely made eye contact when she spoke to me. Our daughter Claire was artistic and restless. She changed jobs often and husbands more than once. Both of them settled down, eventually had children of their own, but somewhere along the way, the kindness slipped out of the room. I'm not sure when it started, maybe after Henry passed, maybe before. What I know is this: I was still hosting Thursday dinners every week, cooking from scratch, folding laundry, watching grandkids when the schools were out handing over checks, when the car broke down or the braces needed tightening. It didn't feel like giving it. Felt like love until it didn't last. Thursday was like most others. We gathered at Mark and Rachel's house. They like things formal, porcelain plates, real linen napkins, the kind of setup where even water has to be poured from a crystal pitcher. Dinner was nearly silent until someone mentioned the potatoes a little burned on the edges. Rachel said, without looking up. Claire snapped that she'd been the only one in the kitchen while I just sat there smiling like I always did. I tried to tell a story about the day Henry and I met, just a small memory. But Mark cut me off, said nobody wanted to hear it again, and Claire called me by a name I hadn't heard out loud. "Shut up, widow," she said to the kids, but loud enough for me to hear, and my grandson repeated it laughing the way boys laugh when they know they won't get scolded. No one told him to stop. No one told Claire to take it back. I excused myself before dessert, and no one tried to stop me. Mark offered a ride, but only out of obligation, and I told him I'd call a cab. It was cold that night, colder than it should have been for May. The cab pulled up in 12 minutes. A boy no older than my youngest grandchild held the door open and asked me where I was headed. I gave him the address of the house I'd lived in for more than 40 years, the one Henry and I bought after he came home from the service. We didn't speak much on the drive, just a few polite words, and that suited me fine. Sometimes, silence is more honest than conversation. I got home, made myself tea, and climbed the stairs to the bedroom that still had 2 pillows on the bed. Out of habit, I slept on the same side I always had. Henry's side stayed untouched that night. I didn't sleep at all. Instead, I sat by the window with a cup in my hand and a line in my mind. I couldn't let go of, "Shut up, widow," not mom, not grandma, just widow, like that's all I'd ever been by the time the sun came up. I'd made a decision, not out of anger, but clarity. I pulled out the old suitcase Henry and I had taken on our honeymoon. The locks still worked. The lining still smelled faintly of lavender. I wasn't sure yet where I'd go, but I knew I was leaving, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel scared. The next morning, I stood in the hallway with the old suitcase open at my feet. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that follows a decision. I folded the blue dress Henry gave me for our 30th anniversary and laid it gently inside. Then came a couple of sweaters, a soft pair of shoes, and the day planner I'd kept since my library years. The jewelry box went in next along with the letters Henry wrote me over the decades. I moved slowly, deliberately, not because I was unsure, but because I knew this was the last time I'd pack in this house. By 10 o'clock, I'd called the realtor. Jenna Holbrook. We weren't exactly close, but we'd crossed paths at book club now and then. She sounded surprised. Margaret, your house? Are you sure? I told her yes, I was sure. She still had a spare key from when she watered my garden last summer. Use it, I said. I'll be gone before lunch. She didn't press, just promised to have it listed by the weekend. Next came the bank. I moved the investments into a separate account, one only I could access. I'd built it slowly over the years. A little money from retirement, a little more from the senior investment group at the community center. Henry always said it was smart to prepare for a rainy day. He'd have called this a thunderstorm. By noon, a cab pulled into the driveway. I walked through the house one last time. The kitchen still smelled faintly of cloves and cinnamon from Thursday's dinner. In the living room, sunlight streamed across the carpet. I paused at the fireplace, where a photo of Henry and me sat in a brass frame our wedding day, both of us beaming like we had all the time in the world. I took it down, wrapped it in a hand towel, and tucked it into my bag. The driver was young, polite, asked where we were headed as he helped with my suitcase. I told him the bus station. Vacation? He asked. No, I said, a new start. We didn't talk much after that. Brinkliff was 3 hours south, a small town tucked between hills and the ocean. The bus rolled in just after 3. It was quiet there, peaceful. No one waiting for me. No questions. No expectations. I looked around, found a bench, and opened my notebook. I'd marked a few addresses during the ride. Rentals mostly. Modest places. A cottage that claimed ocean views. An apartment above a bakery. I started with the cottage. It wasn't much. A 1-bedroom with peeling shutters and a sagging porch. The owner, a stern woman named Gladys, looked me over with a frown. You alone? She asked. I told her yes. Good. I don't rent to party types. Inside, the stove clicked but didn't light. The walls smelled of mothballs and mildew. She named a price that didn't match what she was offering. I thanked her and moved on. The second place was worse. Tiny windows, no cross breeze. A radiator that clanged like it hadn't been bled since the 80s. The third was an apartment on the 3rd floor of a red brick building near the town square. The kind with tall windows and a narrow balcony. The landlord was a man about my age with clear eyes and a trimmed beard. You must be Margaret, he said, offering a handshake. Lionel Gardner. We spoke yesterday. He showed me around. The kitchen was small but clean. The bedroom looked east. Mornings would be bright. The living room had a bay window that opened out toward the sea. I didn't need to think about it. I'll take it, I said. We signed the papers in his kitchen. Lionel lived across the hall. If you need anything, he said, just knock. Then he handed me the keys and left me to settle in. I stood in the middle of the room, suitcase in hand. My things looked small in the space. I took out the photo of Henry and placed it on the bedside table. Then I opened the window and stepped onto the balcony. You could just see the ocean if you leaned out far enough. The air smelled of salt and wild grass. I breathed it in. That night, I slept. Not just closed my eyes, but slept deep and dreamless. In the morning, the bakery downstairs sent up the smell of warm bread. I got dressed and walked down for breakfast. The woman behind the counter had gray at her temples and laugh lines around her eyes. Her name tag read Louise. New around here, she asked. Is it that obvious? Louise smiled. You'll like it here. People keep to themselves, but they're kind. She brought me coffee and a salmon omelet with dill. I'd never eaten alone in a cafe before. I took my time. No one needed me. No one was waiting. After breakfast, I asked about the library. Louise pointed up the hill toward Willow Street. Can't miss it. Looks like an old courthouse. She was right. Red brick, white columns, big glass doors. I walked slowly, stopping once to watch a dog chase a kite across the park. The library's front desk was manned by a young woman with red hair and thick glasses. Good morning, she said. Can I help you? I'd like a library card. She handed me a form. Welcome to Brinkliff. I'm Audrey Finch, head librarian. We talked for a while. I told her about my years as a librarian in Richmond. Her eyes lit up. We've been looking for someone to do Saturday readings for the children, she said. Our last volunteer fell and broke her hip. I almost said no, but I didn't. I'd be happy to, I said. Audrey took me on a short tour. The children's corner had beanbags and low shelves. The reading room smelled like lemon oil and old pages. I picked a chair near the window and sat for a while with a copy of St. Maybe. The words didn't come easy at first, but after a few pages they did. Over the next few days, I filled the apartment with small things. A curtain with yellow flowers. A plant for the windowsill. A second-hand rocking chair like the one I used to have in my school library. I started each morning with coffee at Louise's. I walked to the library or down to the pier. I ignored the messages that piled up on my phone. By the end of the first week, there were dozens. Missed calls, voicemails, texts. First from Claire, then Mark, then Rachel. Some polite, some angry, some pretending to worry. I didn't answer any of them. The last one said, Mom, please, just tell us where you are. I didn't reply. Instead, I opened the balcony door, stepped out into the late afternoon sun, and breathed in the sea air. Below me, someone was strumming a guitar on the stoop. Children were laughing down the block. There was no bitterness in me, no triumph, just quiet. And that was enough. The first Saturday I read to the children, I arrived early. Audrey met me at the door with a smile and a stack of picture books tied together with twine. The reading room had been rearranged pillows in a half circle, a little wooden chair for the reader crayons, and paper stacked neatly at the craft table in the back. A few children trickled in, then more, until there were nearly a dozen cross-legged on the rug, their eyes watching every move I made. I chose The Wind in the Willows to start my voice steady but soft. By the time I reached the part where Mole met Rat by the river, I'd forgotten about the phone calls, the house in Richmond, the heaviness I'd carried with me for years. When I finished, a small boy named Eli raised his hand and asked if I could read again next week. I told him yes. Afterwards, I walked down to the cafe and ordered a cup of coffee. Louise waved me over to her usual corner table and pointed out the almond scones fresh from the oven. We talked about the library, the children, the weather. Nothing heavy. Just ordinary talk that felt more comforting than I expected. The next week moved gently. I filled my days with library work and quiet errands. I planted herbs on the balcony, picked out new curtains for the kitchen, and bought a basket to carry my books to and from the library. I walked to the farmer's market on Wednesday morning and came home with fresh peaches and a jar of wildflower honey. Lionel stopped by most afternoons, usually with something small, a newspaper clipping he thought I'd like, or a book he'd just finished. One evening, he invited me to a jazz concert in the park. I hadn't been to a concert since Henry passed. We sat on a blanket beneath the trees and listened as the band played Louis Armstrong and Billie Holiday. The wind picked up around dusk, and Lionel offered me his jacket. On the walk home, we didn't speak much, but the silence felt easy. When we reached our building, he paused outside my door. "There's a local art show next Friday," he said. "If you're free?" I nodded. "That sounds nice." Back inside the apartment felt warmer somehow. I made tea and sat by the window watching the lights flicker in the houses across the street. I almost didn't hear my phone buzz. 24 missed calls, 11 new messages. Mark, Claire, Rachel. Even the grandchildren. The latest message read, "Mom, Vanity's 5th grade graduation. You need to be there. She expects it." I sat with the phone in my lap for a long time, not because I didn't care, but because I didn't know what to say. Once, a message like that would have made me pack a bag and book a train ticket. This time, I just opened the drawer of my desk and put the phone inside. Then I went to the calendar and wrote down Friday. Art show with Lionel. By early June, I'd been gone nearly 2 months. The house was on the market. Jenna said she had interest from a young couple with twins. The thought of someone else living there didn't bring sadness the way I thought it might. Instead, it felt like passing something along like a book loaned to a friend. Then one morning, Jenna called. Her voice was tight. "Margaret, your children have contacted an attorney. They're trying to block the sale." I stood by the window watching a seagull circle the water tower at the edge of town. "On what grounds they're claiming the house is family property? Something about right of occupancy. It's a long shot legally." I thanked her and hung up. That afternoon, I pulled out the folder from my desk. Inside were the original deeds, the will from my parents' tax records, utility bills, all in my name. Henry had always insisted we keep everything organized. I called Arthur Gillespie, the same attorney who'd handled our estate paperwork years ago. He remembered me right away. "They don't have a case," he said after reviewing the documents. "But I'll handle it. You focus on your new life." I didn't sleep much that night. I made tea, walked the apartment, stood out on the balcony, and listened to the waves. There was no anger in me, no panic. Just a quiet ache that even now, with everything laid bare, they couldn't see me as anything but a resource. A week later, the first letter arrived, Mark's handwriting on the envelope. Inside was a carefully written message, polite in tone, but not in meaning. Words like legacy, family, trust our memories. He spoke of the house as if I'd built it for them alone. Not a single question about how I was doing. Not one mention of happiness or peace or love. I placed the letter in a drawer with the rest of the unopened messages. Then I went outside and joined Louise for lunch at a picnic table behind the cafe. Over the next few weeks, I kept to my routine. Morning walks, library work, children's readings on Saturdays. Lionel and I started trading books. He'd underline passages and leave notes in the margins, thoughts about the story, questions he wanted to ask me. I'd do the same. Sometimes I'd leave a cookie or a new tea bag inside the front cover. One afternoon, after reading Charlotte's Web to a group of third graders, I came home to a voicemail from Arthur. "The court has dismissed the case. The sale can proceed." I replayed the message twice, just to be sure. Then I stood in the kitchen with my hand on the counter and let the moment settle. I didn't call anyone. I didn't cry. I just made tea and opened the window. The town was quiet. The air smelled like salt and lemon. The next morning, the phone rang again. This time, it was Claire. Then Mark. Even Rachel. I didn't answer. That evening, a new message lit up on the screen. "We're coming to Brinkliff on Saturday. We need to talk." I looked at the phone, then turned it face down on the table. Outside, the streetlights flickered on, one by one. Somewhere down the block, someone was practicing the piano, just the right hand, slow and careful. Saturday was only 3 days away. Saturday morning came with soft light through the curtains and the sound of someone watering plants on the balcony next door. I'd been up since dawn, though I hadn't slept much the night before. I ironed a simple blue dress, the one with the narrow sleeves, and left my hair down. Not styled, just brushed. I made coffee but didn't drink it. The clock on the wall clicked past 10, then 10:30. At 11, the doorbell rang. I opened it to find Mark and Claire standing side by side in the hallway. They looked smaller than I remembered. Older, too. Claire held her purse with both hands, her lips pressed tight. Mark had his sleeves rolled up as if he'd just come from some errand. "Mom," he said, "we need to talk." I stepped aside. "Come in." They walked into the living room, looking around as if trying to make sense of it. The windows were open. The couch had a fresh cover on it. Books were stacked neatly on the coffee table. Claire's eyes paused on the photograph of Henry beside the lamp. Mark stayed standing. "This doesn't feel like home," he said. "It isn't," I replied. He exhaled hard through his nose, then sat on the edge of the couch. Claire sat next to him, her bag still in her lap. "We just want to know what's going on," she said. "You left without a word. The kids are asking questions. You didn't even come to Vanity's graduation." I sat in the chair across from them. "I needed space," I said. "Time to think." Mark leaned forward. "You've always been the one who holds the family together. You helped us raise our kids. You helped with the house, the bills. You can't just walk away from all of that." Claire's voice came in softer. "They miss you, Mom. Obadiah and Vanity. Even Willow. She made you a card." I looked at both of them carefully. "You say I can't walk away, but you've both been walking over me for years." Claire opened her mouth, but I held up a hand. "I'm not saying this to hurt you. I just want to be clear. I gave because I wanted to. I cooked, I babysat, I paid when you needed help. But I don't want to live a life where I only matter when someone needs something." Mark frowned. "So that's it, you're just cutting us off." "I'm drawing a line," I said. Claire sat back. "We were wrong. Okay, we've been selfish, but we're here now. We want to fix it," Mark added. "We'll include you more. Bring you into decisions. We've talked about that." "Right, Claire." She nodded. "We want you at family dinners again. The kids should see you. Learn from you. We know we haven't always said thank you." I looked down at my hands resting in my lap. "I'm not angry," I said, "but I'm not going to pretend things are fine just because you want them to be. I want a relationship that isn't based on what I can give." Mark's jaw tightened. "This is about the house, isn't it? You're selling it just to prove something." "I'm selling it because I no longer live there," I said. "It's my house. It was left to me by my parents. I've taken care of it all these years, paid every tax, repaired every leak. It's time for someone else to make memories there." Claire blinked quickly. "What about us? Where do we stay when we visit Elk Grove? You're not even giving us the chance to talk this through." "You can stay at a hotel," I said gently, "or with friends. You have friends in Elk Grove?" The room went still, the kind of stillness that stretches too long. Then Mark stood. "If that's how you feel," he said, "then I guess we're wasting our time." Claire remained seated. "You don't miss us. The kids?" "Of course I do," I said. "I'll always love you. I just can't go back to being someone who disappears behind the needs of everyone else." Claire's voice dropped. "Can't you just help us a little longer? Just until we get past this rough patch I stood too. You're both in your 40s. You have degrees, jobs. You make more money than I ever did at the library. This isn't about ability. It's about habit." Mark looked toward the door. "So that's your final word?" "It is." He turned and walked out. Claire stood more slowly. "Will you send Willow a birthday card?" she asked. "She turns 13 next month." "I will," I said. "And a gift too." Claire nodded, then followed her brother out. I closed the door behind them and leaned against it, feeling the wood against my back. My heart was racing, but it wasn't from fear. It was from something steadier, something solid. I walked to the kitchen, made a fresh pot of coffee, and brought it out to the balcony. The sun was bright. The air smelled faintly of salt and something sweet, probably from the cafe down the block. I sat with my cup watching the street below. Across from me, Lionel stepped out with his dachshund and waved. "Lovely day," he called. I smiled and nodded. "It is." The breeze moved gently through the trees, and somewhere down the block, a child laughed. I finished my coffee, took the mug inside, and wrote a note for Willow's birthday. I didn't overthink it. Later that afternoon, Lionel sent a message asking if I'd like to walk down to the water. I told him I would. From the kitchen window, I could see Mark and Claire getting into their car. Claire had her arms folded. Mark was gesturing sharply with one hand. I didn't look away. I didn't smile. I didn't turn to watch them drive off. I just rinsed my coffee cup and set it out to dry. Later that evening, after Mark and Claire had driven away, I changed into walking shoes and met Lionel at the front steps. His dachshund, Oliver, tugged gently on the leash, already eager to start. The boardwalk was quiet, just a few people lingering with ice cream cones and small dogs. We didn't talk much at first. The tide was low, and the air carried the scent of seaweed and distant bonfires. Lionel kept a slow pace to match mine, and Oliver sniffed every post like it held a secret. When we reached the far end of the promenade, Lionel paused and nodded toward a bench. We sat facing the water, the last bit of light slipping under the horizon. "Your children came," he said gently. I nodded. "They left about an hour ago." He didn't press, just reached into his pocket and handed me a folded paper menu. "There's a little French place on Main Street. Thought we might try it Friday." I looked at the menu, then at him. "That sounds nice." When I got home, the apartment was still warm from the sun. I opened a window, let the night air drift in, and turned on the kettle. I didn't check my phone. The next morning, I found another voicemail mark again. His tone was quieter, but the words carried the same weight. "Mom, we're in a tight spot. Tabitha's job ended unexpectedly. Obadiah's sports camp is out of state. Could you help? Just a little. We'll pay it back." I didn't listen to the end. I pressed delete. That afternoon, I opened my closet and pulled down the small wooden box that held my wedding ring. I hadn't worn it since the day Mark and Claire came. I turned it over in my hand, then slipped it into my coat pocket and walked into town. The jewelry shop sat between a hardware store and a florist. A small bell rang as I opened the door. Behind the counter stood Mr. Eberthy, a quiet man with wire-rimmed glasses and a loop magnifier tucked into the collar of his vest. He looked up and smiled. "Mrs. Weller, what can I help you with?" I placed the ring on the velvet tray between us. "I'd like to have it melted down into something new. A bracelet, maybe?" He examined it carefully. 18 karat. Good condition. "Are you sure?" I nodded. "I'd like to wear it, just not in the same way." We talked for a while about design. Something simple. A clean band with our wedding date engraved on the inside. He jotted notes on a pad and told me it would be ready in 2 weeks. As I stepped back onto the sidewalk, I rubbed the spot on my finger where the ring had rested for over 4 decades. It felt lighter now. Not empty, just different. On Thursday, I picked up a new dress for the summer festival. Soft linen with a pale green pattern. I stopped by the bakery and bought 2 small loaves of sourdough, one for me, one for Lionel. When I got home, there was another letter in the mail. A card from Willow. Inside was a photo of her in costume, smiling wide with flowers in her hair. Grandma Trixie, she'd written, "I'm playing Ophelia in our school play. June 18th. I wish you could come." I stood at the counter with the photo in my hand for a long time. Her handwriting was careful, the letters spaced wide. I placed the card on the mantel beside the picture of Henry. Then I sat down with a cup of tea and wrote her back. On Friday, Lionel and I went to the French restaurant. It was tucked behind a bookstore small and quiet, with white tablecloths and candles in glass jars. We shared a plate of trout almondine and split a lemon tart for dessert. He told me stories about his time teaching literature, how the freshmen always dreaded the Odyssey, how he met his wife in the stacks of the university library. I told him about the time Henry proposed to me beside a fountain and dropped the ring into the water by accident. After dinner, we walked back through the park, passing a couple practicing a dance near the gazebo. A few notes of piano drifted from a nearby house. When we reached my door, Lionel hesitated. "You know," he said, "I think I've laughed more in the past 2 months than I have in years." I smiled. "So have I." He tipped his head, wished me good night, and walked across the hall to his own apartment. The next morning, I went to the library early to prepare for reading hour. Audrey was waiting by the front desk with a stack of new titles. "You've got a following," she said, handing me Charlotte's Web. "They ask for you every week." The children gathered on the rug, their faces tilted upward as I read about Wilbur and Fern. I turned each page, slowly pausing now and then so the little ones could study the drawings. When the reading was done, Eli handed me a picture he'd drawn of a spider in a web. "It's Charlotte," he said proudly. I thanked him and tucked it into my satchel. The rest of the weekend passed quietly. I walked along the waterfront, visited the farmer's market, and helped Audrey catalog a new donation of large print books. On Sunday evening, I made a list of places I'd always wanted to visit. Alaska, the Inside Passage, Denali. I opened the travel site on my laptop and stared at the cruise schedule for a long time before clicking confirm. 10 days. Just me. Mountains, whales, glaciers, and sky. I closed the lid and leaned back in my chair. Then I opened the desk drawer, took out the envelope with Willow's photo, and slid a small bookmark inside a pressed wildflower, one I'd picked on a walk near the bluffs. Outside, the street was quiet. The light from the bakery's back window spilled onto the sidewalk. I stood there for a moment, watching the dust rise in the beam like snow. I packed light for the cruise, just one small suitcase and my canvas tote. 3 sweaters, a pair of hiking shoes, and the green linen dress I'd worn to the summer festival. I tucked in the new bracelet Mr. Eberthy had made from my wedding ring. It was simple and smooth, cool against my wrist. I fastened it just before boarding, feeling the metal settle like something finished. The ship pulled away from port just after sunset, the water dark as ink behind us. I stood on the deck a long time, watching the shoreline shrink into a line of lights. Then I went inside, found the dining room, and ate dinner beside a couple from Ohio who had been married for 53 years. They asked polite questions, shared stories about their grandkids, and told me to look for whales in the morning. The next day, we entered a narrow channel flanked by steep cliffs and patches of snow. I wrapped myself in a blanket and sat with my coffee on the observation deck. A guide came on the speaker naming glaciers and birds and channels carved by ice thousands of years ago. I wrote some of the names down in my notebook. At one point, a bald eagle passed overhead, its wings stretched wide against the gray sky. On the 4th night, I joined a watercolor class in one of the lounges. We were told to paint a single object, whatever came to mind. Most people chose flowers or waves or trees. I painted my old house. Just the front porch and the mailbox, but I didn't shade it with grief. I left the windows open, the curtains, light the sky behind it blue. When I returned to my cabin, there was a message on the phone from Audrey back home. "Just letting you know," she said, "a man came by the library asking for you. Wouldn't leave his name. Said he used to know your late husband. Said he had something important to give you." I pressed the receiver to my ear, waiting to hear if she would say more, but that was it. The next morning, I sat in the reading room and watched the shoreline slip past. A steward walked by with a tray of cocoa. I asked for 2 cups and took one to a woman sitting by herself near the far windows. Her name was Margot. She lived in Seattle. We talked until the sky darkened and the mountains disappeared behind fog. On the final day of the cruise, I wrote out postcards to Audrey Willow and Lionel. I kept one for myself, dated it, and slipped it into the notebook where I'd listed the names of glaciers. I saw whales this morning, I wrote. They rose together, then vanished. Back home, I stepped off the bus at the corner and wheeled my suitcase past the bakery. The scent of cinnamon hit me as the door opened for someone else. Inside the apartment, everything was still and familiar. I unpacked slowly, folded my sweaters, and placed the green dress in the laundry basket. I slid the bracelet onto the dresser and opened the window to let the breeze in. Later that week, I returned to the library. Audrey met me near the reference section. The man who came by, she said he dropped this off yesterday. She handed me a large manila envelope. My name was written on the front in tidy script, Trixie Weller. No return address. Inside was a single folded letter and an old photograph of Henry, much younger, sitting on a bench I didn't recognize. I turned it over. On the back it read, 1984, St. Mary's, D.C. The letter was written in blue ink, a little shaky in places but clear. The man's name was Leonard. He had served with Henry in the Army during a brief deployment stateside in the early 80s. They'd shared quarters for 4 months, he said, and kept in touch sporadically afterward. I meant to reach out sooner, the letter said, but when I read Henry's name in the paper, I realized too much time had passed. There's something I believe you deserve to know. It went on to explain that Henry had helped Leonard during a difficult time, covering for him during a family emergency, lending him money when Leonard's son was hospitalized, even offering a place to stay if Leonard ever needed it. I don't know what kind of man he was as a husband or father, the letter said, but he was the kind of friend who showed up without being asked. I stood in the back office holding the photograph and let the words settle. Audrey watched me carefully. You okay? I nodded. Yes. That night, I sat with the photo under the reading lamp. I thought about the Henry I had known, quiet, careful, always polite. I hadn't known about his time with Leonard. I hadn't known much about his service at all, but it was like finding a corner of a puzzle you didn't expect, one that fit even if it didn't change the picture. I placed the photograph in a frame and set it on the bookcase. The next day, I called the local historical society. They were hosting a community gathering the following week, a storytelling evening open mic format. I asked if they needed volunteers. The woman on the phone said yes, and would I be willing to read a letter from the archives aloud. Something personal. A piece of local history. I said I would. On Sunday, Lionel knocked on my door with a bag of scones. We sat on the balcony while Oliver napped under the table. He asked about the cruise, and I told him about the whales, the watercolor class, and the quiet mornings on the deck. Think you'll take another trip? He asked. I think I might, I said. From across the courtyard, a wind chime rang faintly in the breeze. I reached into my notebook and tore out the list of places I'd written before the cruise. I folded it into a new envelope and addressed it to myself. Next to Alaska, I wrote 2 more names. Under the glow of the town library's front lights, I paused before going in. The storytelling evening was already underway. People clustered near the coffee table, balancing cookies and paper cups. A whiteboard near the entrance listed the evening's readers. My name was written in red marker, 3rd from the bottom. I took a breath, walked in, and found an empty chair in the 2nd row. The woman before me was finishing a letter from her grandmother, written in 1947. It spoke of laundry hung between trees' ration coupons and a man she'd once kissed on a train. The room was quiet when she folded the page and smiled. Everyone clapped softly. When my name was called, I stood and walked to the front. I'd brought the letter Leonard had written about Henry, and I read it aloud just as he'd written it. I didn't add anything, didn't change a word. The room stayed still except for one man in the back who reached into his coat for a handkerchief. Afterward, a man approached me, tall, older, with a deep scar on his jaw. He introduced himself as Tom, a veteran who'd also served with Henry, though not at the same time as Leonard. He'd recognized the name in the letter. "We had mutual friends," he said. "You said a lot without saying too much." I thanked him, folded the letter, and slid it back into my purse. Over the next few weeks, something shifted, not loud or obvious, but steady. I started walking Oliver to the park every morning instead of just letting him out on the porch. I said yes to lunch when Audrey invited me instead of saying I had errands. I even signed up to teach a memoir writing class at the community center just 6 Tuesday mornings in the fall. Lionel stopped by more often, usually with something to drop off: homemade jam, a book he'd just finished, a pair of gloves he found in a discount bin and thought might fit my hands. Once he stayed long enough to fix the kitchen drawer that kept sticking. We didn't talk about Alaska or the letter, but he did ask if I'd seen any more bald eagles. I said no, but I'd been looking. One afternoon, while clearing out a drawer, I found a sealed envelope marked in Henry's handwriting, "For Trixie, open if I don't come home." The ink had faded a little, but I knew the loops and spacing like I knew my own. I didn't open it right away. I made a cup of tea first, sat on the balcony, watched a pair of squirrels chase each other across the power lines. Then finally, I slid it open. Inside was a short note, only 4 lines. "Trix, if this finds you, I hope the pain has softened. I never meant to leave like that. The best of me was always yours. I hope you find something new that belongs only to you. H." I folded the letter and placed it beside Leonard's in a small wooden box on the shelf. Then I opened my journal and added another line to the list of places I wanted to see. Later that week, I called the senior travel coordinator at the community center. Her name was Ruth, and she'd led the Alaska cruise. I asked if they were planning anything for the spring. She said yes, 2 options: a garden tour through South Carolina or a quiet rail trip up through Vermont and into Quebec. I chose the rail trip. She asked if I'd like a private room or to be paired with another traveler. I asked for private. Then I smiled and said, "But I wouldn't mind sitting with someone during dinner." The day the final itinerary arrived in the mail, I walked it over to Audrey's desk at the library. She scanned the page and nodded. "You'll like this one. Good mix of scenery and stops. Plenty of time to read." I told her I was planning to bring a new notebook. Not just for journaling, but for sketching too. I'd picked up a new set of pencils at the bookstore and a book on perspective. "You're doing it," she said. "You're really moving forward." I didn't answer right away, just smiled and folded the paper back into my purse. Outside, the trees along Main Street had started to change color edges, tinged with orange, the sidewalks dotted with crisp, curling leaves. I paused at the florist's window. A small chalkboard sign read, "Fall is proof that endings can be beautiful." I stayed a moment longer, then walked on the wind, brushing gently at my coat. The train ride through Vermont passed like a slow dream. Pine trees dusted with late frost. Little towns with porches still wrapped in garland, rivers half frozen beneath the bridges. I kept my sketchbook open on the table beside me, but most of the time, I just looked out the window. At one of the quiet stops near the Canadian border, I stepped out to stretch my legs and saw a small girl waving at the train. Her mittens were too big, and she stood next to a woman who could have been her grandmother. They reminded me of a picture I once saw in Henry's wallet of a little girl with braids and a crooked smile. He'd told me it was his niece. I never met her. I returned home the first week of March. Lionel helped carry my suitcase up the stairs, and when he left, he said, "You look rested." I told him I was. That night, I unpacked my sketchbook and flipped through the pages. There were drawings of birch trees, coffee cups, old train stations. But tucked between 2 pages was something else. A note I'd forgotten, I wrote. It simply said, "Go where the silence leads." I didn't remember writing it, but I left it there. April brought crocuses and early robins. Audrey asked if I'd consider reading at the spring gathering again this time. Not someone else's letter, but something of my own. I said I'd think about it. A week later, I sat down and began writing what would become the first pages of a memoir. I didn't know yet if it was about Henry or about me. Maybe both. I just wrote what I remembered. One morning, I stopped by the cemetery. I hadn't visited in years. There was still no stone for Henry, just a small plaque placed by the army long ago. I sat down in the grass and told him about the trip, about the train, the towns, the way the cold air smelled like cedar and pine. I told him Leonard's letter had made it into the library archives, that people still listened. I stayed until the wind picked up, then stood brushed off my coat and walked back to the car. These days, the house feels lighter. I've moved some things around, not to erase anything, but to make room for what's next. The dining room table now holds a vase of fresh flowers. The bookshelf has a space cleared just for my notebook. There are still quiet days, and I still miss the people I've lost. But there's peace now. Not the kind that comes from forgetting, but the kind that comes from remembering without breaking. I've learned that silence doesn't always mean emptiness. Sometimes it's a resting place, a pause before something new begins. Thank you for listening to my story. If it brought something to mind, someone you've loved, or a quiet strength you've found, feel free to share it in the comments. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, you're welcome to stay a while.